Hello! So it's a warm Sunday afternoon here at home. Frankly, it's too hot for me to go outside. I've had enough of this heat. We've had it for weeks now. I prefer somewhere a bit colder. Anyway, this video, I thought I would run through some of the tools I use and ways that I plan a landscape photography trip. One or two people have asked me this in the past. They've sort of said, how do you work out where you're going to go? How do you know what time of year you want to go? How do you even find these places? Because half of them you go to I've never even heard of. You know, I've told friends at work I'm off to the Lofoten Islands, for example, in the past, and they're like, where the hell's that? So yeah, they're kind of curious how I find these places. So I guess that's the first point, is inspiration. A lot of you will probably have a massive, great big list of places you already know you'd like to visit. And if you do, then bits later on in this video are probably going to be more useful. But how do you go about finding them in the first place? What if you've got literally no idea where in the world you would like to go next? How can we work out where we want to go? So it turns out, if we hop over onto the computer, one of the ways I find places to go is just seeing what comes up on sites like 500 Pics as the current popular pictures. Generally, places that are attractive to photograph result in nice images from decent photographers, and they tend to bubble to the top of the charts here. So it's a pretty good starting point, and this isn't necessarily the sort of thing you would do just in one little session like we're going to do now. What I tend to do is visit this every few days or whatever, and over a while you start to see the same locations crop up, and you start to realise that that's somewhere you might want to go. But pretty much for any images that you like the look of, we can just open them in a new tab quickly. So this sort of waterfall and landscape here is pretty nice. I like that. I've got no idea where it is, so we'll open that one up. Same goes for this little church. This one we've got some northern lights on and a nice snowy mountain, so I'm guessing that's up in Norway somewhere, but we'll open that one and have a quick look at it. This I am guessing is probably somewhere over in the US in one of their national parks, so we can take a look at that one. And pretty much, yeah, you just sort of scroll down the page, find places that that you think, yeah, that looks like a place I might like to visit at some point. Some nice mountains reflected there. Some pretty similar looking mountains. I don't think they're quite the same ones, but we'll have a look at those as well. So once you've got a little short list of stuff, we can then start to have a look at the details on each image and work out where they actually are. So this is a very nice picture by Daniel here. We can have a look. So the description of his photo isn't massively helpful because it doesn't tell us where this picture was taken. So for the purposes of planning a trip, he's not been massively helpful. But if we scroll down, we've got a few comments from people. If we scroll down the actual page, then there's the tags at the bottom. And we can start to see here Bavaria, Hintersee, Alps. So this tells us that this is probably somewhere in southern Germany, towards the Alps. So we can ping through, have a look at a few more of these. This one by Louis, he's telling us here that this waterfall is on the island of Flores in the Azores. So, you know, we can now say, okay, well, we'll keep an eye out for other shots from maybe from the Azores in general or from that particular island, see if that's somewhere we may want to come up with a trip to eventually. This one, it's someone else peddling another workshop holiday by the looks of it. And I guess down here in the tags, there's also not a huge amount there to tell us where this is taken either. So yeah, that's not particularly helpful. We don't really know where that is. We may see it crop up by a different photographer and sort of do a bit of cross-referencing, but no worries. So this is the one where I said it's probably off in Norway somewhere, Emerald Fortitude. No real description, but again, if we scroll down, look at the tags, yeah, we can see that's over in the Lofoten Islands. So, you know, a very popular location, and we could probably work out exactly where that is by seeing some of the similar images of the same mountain later on. So you kind of get the idea. This one again has no useful description, but we can look on the tags, kind of work it out. So yes, it's the USA. None of the tags tell us a huge amount more. This one here, Mandelwand. Let's see, whereabouts is this? Doesn't tell us, but we do have the name of the place there, so we could, for instance, then go to Google and just type it in, and we see, yeah, okay, a few images coming up. There's a lodge, apparently, and we can have a look on maps, see where that comes up. Can't find it. Helpful. So you can see you need to do a little bit of research, a little bit of digging around. I'm guessing this is somewhere in the Alps, again from the name. It's kind of an interesting one, this, because it comes up a lot as the name of the images, but it doesn't come up as an actual location. Anyway, I digress. You get the idea. So the other mountains that looked similar to the last ones, we can see there in the Tyrol in Austria. So that's kind of close to the Italian border. They look a little bit Dolomitey, which I can tell from the planning I've been doing there. So that's pretty much how I go about getting inspiration, is just keeping an eye on popular sites like 500 Pics. It's also worth maybe sort of following landscape photography tags or popular landscape photographers on things like Instagram as well. And over a while, you'll start to sort of get an idea of where you might like to visit. So what we'll do next is we'll sort of plan an imaginary trip. So we'll decide we're going to go somewhere. For the purposes of this video, let's pretend we're going on a holiday to Iceland. And there's a few locations that we've decided we want to try and photograph. So how do we then go about planning that trip? So, part 2, how the hell do we decide when to go? More tea. Okay, when to go. That's the next thing. Once you've decided where you're going, when you're going, seems straightforward enough. I'll go when the weather's nice. That's what most people would decide to do if they were going on a summer holiday. But for a landscape photography trip, obviously we have kind of different priorities. We don't necessarily want nice blue skies and sunny days. Although they're okay to wander around in, they're not so good for taking photos. You may be limited by things like school holidays, so if you've got kids, it might be that you can't really go away at certain times of the year. But for the purposes of this, we said, as an example, we're going to plan a trip to Iceland. Now, Iceland's kind of near the Arctic Circle, which means, although it's not quite within the Arctic Circle, it still falls under the same problem of during the summer there's very little night time, during the winter there's very little daylight. So you start to think about things like, well, I know a lot of people go to Iceland and photograph the Northern Lights. Would I like to photograph the Northern Lights? If you do, then there's not much point going in June because the sky never gets dark. But what you would see in June maybe is certain types of flowers, certain types of birds. So if you're more into shooting nature, that kind of thing, then it turns out June might be a really good time to go, or May, something like that. Obviously, if you go in the middle of winter, there's very little daylight, so unless you just want to be doing a lot of nightscapes and increasing your chances of seeing the Northern Lights to the maximum possible, you probably don't want to be going there in the middle of December either. So somewhere like Iceland, if you want a nice mix of sort of daytime, nighttime, you're kind of looking spring or autumn. So, you know, anything from sort of March, April time maybe. On the other side of the year, you've got sort of September, October. You then have to think about things like the weather. So if you go in March, the chances are there's still going to be quite a lot of snow around from winter. So you might find a lot of the roads are still closed. Only the sort of main roads will be open. Whereas you go sometime like September, there's no snowfall yet, so you might find a lot more of the roads are still open. So these are some of the considerations. Other things is how much you want to spend. If you go in the middle of summer, it tends to be peak tourist season. Everything will cost a lot more. There'll be a lot more people around. You go in the middle of October, the weather's a lot drearier. Most people are at work still, so fewer people around. Things will cost a little bit less. So there's research to do, and the research you need to do will differ depending on where you're going. So if you suddenly decide you're going to plan to go on a safari in southern Africa, suddenly you're not worried about things like the Northern Lights, but you need to worry about when rainy seasons are, when animals are there, or whether they've all migrated elsewhere, whether it's full of mosquitoes at certain times of the year. There's different problems you need to work out. So a quick Google will often tell you simple things like sunrise and sunset times, but I tend to prefer slightly more accurate tools, because other things I might want to know is whether there's a full moon or not. So again, if we hop over to the computer, one common tool is the photographer's ephemeris. The iOS app for this is meant to be very good. The Android app, and unfortunately I'm an Android user, is not quite so good, but it serves a purpose. But here we're using the website version, which is free to use. You don't even need to pay for it, which is kind of handy. So here we are looking at Iceland. I literally typed in Iceland, which is why it's picked a random spot in the middle of the country. Oops. So as an example, let's say one of the places we wanted to go on our trip was to take an image at the Gullfoss waterfall, which, if memory serves me correctly, is off somewhere down here. There we go, you can tell I've been before. And if we just ping over onto satellite view, we can see the waterfall there. So we might think, what time of year will... and pressing this button just sort of recenters the pointer on the map, but once we can see it, we can kind of drag it around. So the sort of visitor centre viewpoint is kind of here, and it's currently dated for today, because I just kind of loaded up the website. So what we can see is that on July the 15th, sunrise is at a fairly hefty 3:30 in the morning. Sunset's not until well gone 11 PM, so we get an awful lot of daylight. There's a slider down the bottom here that lets us then adjust this, so we can see where the sun and moon move around the land. So if we go and find 3:30 in the morning when the sun comes up, you'll see we've now got a golden ring appear, and as I move the slider, this orange line here shows where the sun would be. So what this tells us is actually, at this time of year, sunrise, or just after sunrise, when we're still in the golden hour, we'd probably get the sun rising kind of directly over the waterfall along the river, pretty much, which might make for quite a nice photo, if that's what you wanted to achieve. Sunset, conversely, if we go to that, which is kind of right down in the middle of the night, is sort of tucked off over the side there, so it's perhaps less impressive. But yeah, this could be an interesting location. But let's say we wanted to capture the Northern Lights, so we need to be picking something more like late September. So let's just pick a random 29th of September. What you'll see now is that the sunset sunrise lines are almost horizontal. Actually, we're just a little bit towards the equinoxes, I guess. So we now see that sunrise is at a much more reasonable 7:23 in the morning. Sunset is at just getting on for 7 PM. And again, we can move the slider and have a look at kind of where that appears and disappears. So we don't get the sun rising over the waterfall anymore. It sort of all occurs behind us, but we might find that when we get to the golden hour, the sun sort of coming across here will light things up quite nicely. So what about another location in Iceland that we could plan for? So one you've probably all seen pictures of before is the Kirkjufell mountain over here with its little waterfall, and the sort of classic landscape shot here is to position ourselves just around here, so we have the nice waterfall cascading down, and if we then have a look, we've got the mountain itself over in the backdrop. So at this time of year, our September time, let's go to sunset. So we'll find that the light is probably going to be shining kind of onto this left-hand side of the mountain. It might not be particularly bright. We might find we've got a lot of shadow over on this side, but if we were to look at sunrise over at 7:30 in the morning, give or take, plus a bit of golden hour time, that might be quite nice because the sunlight's a bit more angled towards the sort of corner of the mountain that we're going to be seeing. If we wanted a bit more light at sunset, so the light's coming more from the southerly direction, we might find if we were to go sort of later in October, let's pick this random time, then we can see that that sunset's kind of moved around. It's even earlier in the day. It's now at kind of 5:40, but it's angled a bit more. So you can kind of play around with this and you can skip forward days at a time and you can actually see how that's changing. And it kind of keeps going. And obviously if we go through to December, so pick some time around, again around the equinox, we'll see that sunrise isn't until 11:42 in the morning. Sunsets at 3:30, well 20 past 3 in the afternoon. So you get a very narrow window of daylight, and obviously the sun won't rise very high. It gets to a maximum of like barely even 2 degrees above the horizon by the looks of it. So you're not going to get much in the way of daytime for photos, but you might find it's kind of interesting. But you get an awful lot of nighttime. Great for the northern lights. So this tool is pretty handy for planning when you might want to go away, and there's other ones as well. So another app I use on Android, which is pretty similar to this, is Sun Surveyor. There is another one which we can look at in a minute for planning similar kind of things, is Photopills, and that's got quite a lot of useful extra tools in it as well. Some of these are free, some of them have premium versions that give you extra features. Some of them cost a little bit of money. It kind of varies from one to another, really. Okay, so we've decided when we're going to go. We're going to go, let's say, late September, like we were looking at a minute ago. So we then need to work out where we're going to stay. So that'll be part 3 of this film. Okay, part 3, where to stay. This is a lot more down to kind of personal preference, really. Different people will have different budgets. They'll have different ideas of what's somewhere they'd like to stay or not. So you've got everything from camping through to 5-star luxury hotels and everything in between, really. It's worth checking regulations in countries that you're planning on going to. For instance, when I was looking at my trip to Italy, I sort of entertained the thought of hiring like a motorhome or something and just parking up at the roadside to sleep at night, but it turned out that's probably not really legal. I think people do it, but I didn't really fancy an Italian police officer knocking on my door at 2 AM and demanding I move on somewhere slightly more appropriate. So campsites, that's great if you enjoy camping. Personally, I'm far too old and creaky to deal with sleeping in a tent and waking up in pain the next morning, but it does have the advantage that it gets you exactly where you want to be. You might be able to camp on top of the mountain ready for sunrise at 4 in the morning if that's the kind of trip you're doing, and I can sort of see the advantage then. So when I go away, generally my first stop tends to be a website like booking.com. Basically I've used them quite a lot, so it's kind of what you're familiar with more than anything. I'm not saying booking.com is particularly better than any other website, but it seems to work fairly well for me. What I will say is use the map view when you're planning on staying somewhere. So for instance, here we are looking at Kirkjufell again on Google Maps. So the little village that's closest to it is this Grundarfjordur place. So if we type that into here, we'll see it's found it. And let's stick with our original idea. Let's say we want to be there for 2 nights, going on my own because it's a photo trip. So through until Monday the 1st of October, search. And this will go off and find a whole bunch of stuff. And we can then sort of have a look down. We'll obviously have an idea of how much we want to be spending. So you can see the stuff at various prices, really. I mean, you've got things that are a couple of hundred here. There's things that are 300, 500, 80. So, you know, if you're kind of price sensitive, we can hit lowest price first, and it'll churn through. So we've got things like, it's warning us that we might be looking at things like dormitories here, which will be several beds in one room. If we only want a private room, we can do that. So it looks like 167 would be our cheapest. But if we go down, we might find places that sound pretty good. So let's, for example, say, oh, this hotel looks nice, it's very pretty. But if we do show on map, that doesn't look anything like there. In fact, the sea is on the other side. So where the hell have we ended up here? Let's zoom out a bit. Well, we're on the other side of the peninsula. So that may or may not be a problem, but if you really wanted to be sort of close to that particular mountain, just so you can sort of nip out there if the northern lights appear, which is what I did on my last trip there, you really want to be just limiting yourself to places close by, which is all this kind of stuff. And actually you'll see a lot of them are already sold out, so luckily I'm not planning on going there in September, otherwise I'd be starting to struggle for accommodation. Obviously you can change your dates and hunt around a little bit, but the purpose of this is basically just so I can sort of point out that using the map view is definitely worth doing when you're planning a trip, because the radius that these search engines tend to go through can end up being quite a long way out. So similar for the waterfall we looked at earlier, Gullfoss waterfall. And let's pick the same dates just for the ease of planning. And again, if we do map view, we can jump straight to it at the top here. You'll see the stuff scattered all over, and if we zoom out a little bit, you'll see we're covering a huge area, and the search results is actually including stuff back out in Reykjavik. If we literally just wanted stuff as close as possible to the waterfall, then we're looking at the Hotel Gullfoss has a room, the one at Giza has a room, these ones are kind of full already. So use the map view, and then you can sort of pinpoint the kind of places that are closest to where you're planning on staying. And that seems to work pretty well when I've done it in the past. Like I say, you don't have to use booking.com. There's a whole bunch of other websites. Some of them may be more popular in the country you live in. I mean, I'm in the UK. You might find if you're in the US, there's a different website that people tend to use for booking this kind of stuff. Things like Airbnb, they're always worth looking at. I haven't used them myself an awful lot yet, but I know a lot of people kind of swear by it. So yeah, it's a case of sort of trawling around different websites really, and putting your dates together. To combine that with the locations you want to visit. And that's kind of how I end up planning a trip, really. Depending on where you're going, though, there are a few extra resources that can sometimes be helpful, and not all of them are computer-based. So we'll look at a couple of those now. So for most destinations in the world, you'll be able to go into a bookshop or go online, Amazon or whatever, and be able to download a typical sort of travel guidebook for wherever you're going. Especially with the case of most popular cities, there will almost always be a little Berlitz handbook or Lonely Planet, something like that. For places that are popular for landscape photography, however, you will sometimes find, if you search around online, slightly more specialised options. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm off to the Dolomites in Italy in a few weeks' time, and I stumbled across this book, Photographing the Dolomites, and this is kind of really handy. So in the front, I'll try and hold this up. We've got a useful sort of whereabouts in the sky, sunrise, sunset are at different times of the year. And along with the actual times at the bottom. So this is a very sort of quick and dirty version of the website I was showing you earlier. And again, knowing that a lot of people, I guess, are map orientated, we've got a map view in the front. Everything's color coded with different regions, and then for each area as we flick through, let's have a look. Just pick an example. So we then got a sort of closer zoomed in version, and the photographer will go on to detail each of the spots he's been to, and it's very much designed for photographers. So everything in here is written as to, you know, you can walk up this path and there's a really good viewpoint here. If you go at this time of day, you might find that the light hits this mountain in a certain way at a certain time of year. So yeah, this book's been pretty cool. I'd already planned most of my trip, or at least where I was staying, before I bought this. But actually this has sort of enabled me to find a few places that I'm going to now plan to stop at in between my travels. So I sort of spend one night in one place and drive to a different place the next night. So this will tell me where to go. Iceland, if ever you do fancy a trip to Iceland, I can heartily recommend this map. And again, I sort of found this mentioned in an online forum, I think, but I will endeavour to open it up. You also get an ebook with this, where the people who authored the map sort of went through each day as they drove around. They drove around the whole country. So let's have a look, and you'll see Iceland here. Areas highlighted in yellow, such as this, are places that are particularly attractive. So you can see the whole peninsula here, where we were looking at Kirkjufell Mountain, for example. That whole area is actually very lovely to visit and photograph. And the mountain, if I bring it over, is kind of marked as a sort of 4-star location. So yeah, this is pretty good. It sort of marks out obvious things like volcanoes, waterfalls, things that are particularly good. He's given a sort of 4 or 5-star rating to. So this has been really handy. In the past, I've sort of looked at different areas on there, and maybe, you know, if they were a small diversion off the route I was taking, you know, I found sort of interesting places to go and visit. Even if it's not staying there overnight, just sort of, you know, a little 20-mile diversion to an interesting lava field, that kind of thing. So not all of your planning has to be done online. There are, you know, books, maps, all sorts of things that can also help. So that's pretty much how I go about planning a trip. So yeah, get your inspiration of where you want to go, work out when you want to go, and then work out where the hell you're going to stay. That can be challenging or not, depending on where you're going. If you're going to a city, there's obviously 1,000,001 places to stay. If you want to be staying very close to a certain landscape feature in the middle of nowhere, it could be a little trickier to get accommodation. I pretty much will always hire a car wherever I go, because it's just easy to get around. A lot of places will have local buses, this kind of thing, but the more rural you go, the less reliable they tend to be, or infrequent. So having a car is certainly recommended, assuming you can drive, of course. So I was going to mention a couple of other ones I use as apps rather than websites. So these are handy when you're out and about for planning slightly more detailed things. So as a quick example, let's take a look at if I was planning a Milky Way shot in the Dolomites, which is something I have actually planned, and I'll show you how the apps can help us do that. Okay, so this app here is called Sun Surveyor. I've been using it for quite a while, and it's really simple to use. That's kind of why I like it. So what we're looking at here, the map is currently centred halfway up a mountain. If I zoom in, which is where I'm currently planning on staying the night when I'm in the Dolomites. And what I was hoping was there's quite a nice mountain here called the Langkofel or Sassolungo. Everything in the Dolomites has two names, one Italian, one German, because it's kind of on the border and used to belong to Austria, I think. So it's very sort of bilingual. And that's quite a distinctive mountain. So what I was kind of hoping is to be able to catch the Milky Way over there when I visit. So if I just bring up here, we're currently looking at today. So if I change it to the beginning of September, which is when I'm there, I forget the exact date. I'll just drop in the 10th for now, it's near enough. And again, similar to the Photographer's Ephemeris website, we have this slider along the bottom that lets us kind of move through time. So we can see the sun there, sort of dropping down, and sunset is at around 7:30 in the evening. And doink, there goes the sun. And we then have these grey circles you can see along the bottom there, and that represents where the Milky Way is in the sky. So let me just bring down that top level for a minute so we can see the mountain. And you'll also see on the timeline at the bottom here a white bar in the middle of the night, which we're sort of in the middle of now if I move back. And that makes those circles on the dial kind of get white and solid. That represents really when the Milky Way is visible. Obviously it's not a hard cut-off point like this does, but depending on your camera technique and light pollution and atmospherics, it may well be visible before that, or it may even not be visible when it suggests it is. But what we can see is that at a reasonably decent sort of 9:30 at night, the Milky Way is positioned just to the west, so from my position it'll be off to the right hand side of that mountain range. So that's potentially going to be quite a nice photo opportunity. So by using this tool I was able to sort of plan exactly when I wanted to be there. With something like the Milky Way, it's obviously relatively faint, and you don't really want the full moon around. So if we just drag back up the panel and scroll through, we can have a look at when the moon is up. And we can see moon rise 7:15 in the morning, moon set 20:08 in the evening. So actually there won't be any moon, which means that for photographing the Milky Way, that's going to be kind of really handy. So there's a few more bits of information we can get in here. The Milky Way centre, it tells us the sort of degrees around, so 180 degrees being south, 0 degrees being north, so 203 is sort of slightly off to the southwest essentially. The 9.9 degrees is how high the centre of the Milky Way is above the horizon. It tells us the times when the Milky Way is visible, so this is sort of claiming, 9:20 at night until 11:20, so 10:30 is kind of right in the middle of that, which is nice. Tells us that's a photo opportunity. We also have the golden hour and the blue hour, which is really useful as a photographer. Knowing this light is always kind of interesting. And we've got things like when the various types of twilight are. So as you know, if you want to be doing sort of proper astrophotography, you really need to be in astronomical twilight or darker. So that tells us 21:20 is when astronomical twilight starts. And that of course is why the Milky Way appears at 21:20. So it's not like at 21:20 it suddenly gets a lot darker. It is a gradual change, but that's the official timing, so that's how when they determine sort of where this bar will work. So this is a really simple app to use, and I quite like it. You don't have to use satellite view. You've got sort of normal map view. You've got terrain view if you want. So yeah, pretty simple to use. Another app I'll use, we'll take a look at now, is Photopills. Okay, so this is the start screen of Photopills, and as you can see, it's got an awful lot of tools in here. So Planner, if we tap through onto that, you'll notice is actually very similar to the one we were just looking at. It's very similar to Sun Surveyor. So again, we've got this kind of scroller. We can see when the light is, you know, daylight or nighttime. It tells us when the Milky Way is visible. So where are we looking at here? This is actually in Switzerland, when I'm potentially looking at a lunar eclipse on the 27th. Oh yeah, we're in the morning there. So yeah, I was kind of using this tool to plan where the moon would be visible. So we know the lunar eclipse is sort of visible around, I don't know, let's say sort of, yeah, what are we on, 10:50 there? And this tells me that in the middle of the village there, the moon would be basically tucked away behind a mountain here. So by moving the map around, I was able to work out, I think, if we zoom in, that if I trek over to this side of the village, the moon should then be visible kind of down this valley here. So that again has been pretty handy. It means that I'm not going to waste time kind of setting up my camera on my hotel balcony or something helpful and then finding that there's a mountain in the way and I can't see it, so I can be there in time. And again, we can scroll through time here and see how long the moon takes to move various places. So that's pretty handy. You can save these as sort of potential trip ideas, which is nice. There's augmented reality view, where it uses the camera in the device. I won't do that here because I'm just sat in my living room, so it won't be very interesting. But you can sort of hold it up and it'll show you where things are in the sky. So quite handy if you're already on location and you're waiting for the moon to rise. You can use the AR view and it will sort of simulate exactly where that's going to appear on the horizon for you. Likewise the sun. Some of the other tools in here are pretty good. So one that I found quite interesting to look at here is spot stars. So if ever you've done any astrophotography, you'll know that you sort of can only shoot for a certain length of time before the stars start to trail, and commonly you'll use the 500 rule, which is where you basically do 500 divided by the focal length of your lens. That tells you how many seconds you can shoot for. So in this example, a 20mm lens would give us 25 seconds, but it also will let you calculate something called the NPF rule, and this takes into account the sensor in your camera as well. The theory being that the higher resolution sensor your camera has, the shorter amount of time you can shoot before trailing really appears. So obviously if you've got lots of tiny pixels, you're going to see movement a lot more than if you've got not very many big pixels. So I've entered my A7R2, which I've got, which is 42 megapixels. And the NPF rule tells me that really I can only shoot for sort of just over 10 seconds before trailing would become really obvious. Now that's to keep the stars at precise pinpoints, which I'm probably not going to want to do, but it's quite an interesting concept. The 500 rule was really aimed back in the days of film cameras. So depending on the conditions, I might choose to shoot slightly shorter, something like 20 seconds, just to help the stars stay pinpointed. And you can obviously choose which camera you've got. There's gazillions of them. And if we go down to Sony, oops, too far. So obviously my A7R2 is the high resolution version. If you're familiar with Sony, you're aware that they have things like the A7S, so that's only 12 megapixels, so it's a much lower resolution sensor. And if we set that, we'll see that NPF rule has jumped from 10 seconds up to 15, or 15 and a half. Theory being, like I say, with sort of bigger pixels and fewer of them, The trailing is much less obvious. So it's kind of interesting. The 500 rule obviously comes out the same because it's a similar sum. So yeah, Photopills. I'm not going to turn this video into a full review because really this was about planning a landscape trip. But yeah, these apps are all worth looking at and will help you plan your trip in different ways. So I hope all that's been useful. Like I say, nothing in there is the right way of doing it or the best way of doing it. It's based on how I go about planning a trip. This may change over time as I decide to go to different locations, or I might try different tools that I find, different websites, you know, different areas of the world. You may plan in a different way, but use all the tools, you know, that you can find, and you're going to basically have more success when you actually get to wherever you're going. So yeah, I look forward to it. Feel free to post in the comments where you're going next, and if there's something I didn't mention in this video that you think would be helpful, stick that in the comments too. Also, of course, feel free to subscribe to this channel. I'm hoping when I head off to the Dolomites to do a few videos from there, showing you some of the locations I'm visiting and how I shoot them. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.